Happy holidays, it's Ryan Pacyga, and I'm with my friend the elf on the shelf and a couple of his buddies over here, and we're going to talk a little bit about how some elves or people might get in trouble over the holidays if they're not careful. Here's some examples. So, let's say the elf is a member of your family. You get him out of the box every year, but this time you've moved houses and the elf comes to find your house. And the elf doesn't have permission to come into the house because the elf is mischievous, but the elf comes into the house anyway without your knowledge. And in doing so, the elf also has the intent to commit a crime, that is criminal damage to property, because he's kind of a messy guy and he likes to break some things while he's up to his mischief. So the elf comes into your house. Now this is whether the house is locked or unlocked, but the elf comes in without permission with the intent to commit a crime. In Minnesota, that is a first-degree burglary of an occupied dwelling, and the elf could go to prison for that. The sentencing guidelines recommend that someone be sent to prison for several years for just doing that. Now, the elf gets in the house, and the elf tips over some chairs and wants to climb up on a shelf up high, and in doing so, the elf breaks one of the chairs. That is criminal damage to property. Boy, is the elf getting in more trouble as we go. So the elf hides out, and the elf is on a shelf, and now some of your family members come around the corner, and they get scared because the elf is sitting on the shelf. And the elf is sitting there with a replica little toy gun. Well, if these people are afraid of the elf has committed a domestic assault, and that's at least a misdemeanor. But if the elf has done this before and been convicted, the elf will be convicted of an enhanced domestic assault, either as a gross misdemeanor or a felony. Now, if this elf really has a gun and it's not a toy gun, even if the elf doesn't intend to use it on you, that elf is already ineligible to possess that firearm because the elf has a prior domestic assault. So the elf is looking at an additional 5-year mandatory minimum sentence just for having the gun, even if he wasn't planning on using it against you. If it's a replica firearm, the elf can be also charged with an assault in the second degree for a dangerous weapon, potentially, and that also will send the elf to prison, whether it's an actual firearm or a replica firearm sometimes. And, of course, if the elf is doing anything that would tend to anger or arouse alarm or resentment in others, that's also a disorderly conduct that the elf has picked up in trying to have some fun at your house as well. Now, if the elf has been in trouble before for this, the elf may still be on probation, and in fact, there might be what's called a domestic abuse no contact order, where the elf isn't supposed to have any contact with you, so the elf has violated that law as well. And when the elf gets a notice to go to court, and the notice is mailed to the elf's old address, and the elf didn't update his driver's license and let the courts know that he's moved, the elf is going to miss his court date. Now he's going to get a warrant out for his arrest for failure to appear at a court date. And when he's finally arrested, the judge is going to set a very high bond because the judge is going to look up Elfie's criminal history as well as Elfie's lack of showing up for court and having a warrant for a prior missed court date. So the elf probably isn't going to be able to afford a bond, is going to be sitting in custody. And the elf's really going to need a lawyer for all of this. Now, if I drive up the elf to help him get into the house, and I'm not going to participate in any of the crimes in the house, but I'm just going to drive him up there knowing that he's going to cause some mischief in there. I have now aided and abetted the elf, and I can be charged with aiding and abetting the elf and committing at least some of these crimes. And if his friend over here takes some steps to help the elf, like maybe helping the elf buy a replica gun or a real gun, or helping the elf find out how to get into the house or break in, for example, then this elf is going to be charged with conspiring to commit these crimes with the elf, and this elf can be put on trial for all of the crimes of this elf as well. So those are some examples of how one little elf can find themselves in a lot of trouble over the holidays, and if you want to be careful, you should make sure not to be going out and doing any of these sorts of things. I hope this educates you on a couple of Minnesota's crimes. Now, what's that? Oh, the elf just told me thanks a lot for telling everybody his plans and that he's going to kill me for telling you all now. Now, that's a terroristic threat or a threat of violence. And if I believe that the elf can be charged with that as well. If the elf is just saying, look, I'm going to kill you, and I really don't believe it, or the elf didn't mean it that way, that's a defense of transient anger. Now, if I later make these accusations against the elf, but in reality I invited the elf to come over to my house, I knew the elf was coming, I knew that the elf had permission to come in my house, I knew that the firearm the elf had was really just a BB gun and it was for fun, and I really didn't feel threatened, but I called the police and alleged all of these things for the elf, the poor elf is going to have to face all these charges and spend tens of thousands of dollars on a lawyer to defend himself. And when the case is eventually either dismissed, or if the elf has to go to trial and be found not guilty of all of these charges, the good news for the elf is that he won't go to prison. The bad news for the elf is he's out all that money that he had to pay for a lawyer, unfortunately. And in the meantime, the odds of me getting charged for making up these false allegations against the elf, well, unfortunately, they're slim to none. And if you're wondering if the elf could then sue me for these false allegations later, again, the odds are slim to none, unfortunately. So be careful. Happy holidays.